We wanted to share with you some of the insights, some of the interim insights that we've captured from a piece of work that the Forum has been running over the course of the last 6 months on regenerative agriculture, which is at least in part touching on elements of what we've been talking about here on the panel session. And so if my colleagues have queued up the presentation, where was the clicker at the end of it? It's here. Very good. We specifically went out to ask this question about what would it take to develop and scale regenerative agriculture in Europe and beyond. And this is very much in line with the Forum's intention to convene with influence, as we say. We love doing these events, and we're incredibly grateful for the time that you spend in them, but we wanted to do it in such a way that we would capture insights from the wealth of experience that we have around the room. So over the last 6 months, we've asked this question to policymakers, people in the European Commission and the European Parliament and the member state governments. We've asked it to people in the value chain, both the companies and indeed the academics and the universities that work within it. And most importantly, I would argue, is where we started, was by asking the question to the growers. And why did we decide to take this on? We took it on because although regenerative agriculture, in terms of the practices, I don't think are particularly new. I mean, I think we've been talking about them for probably most of my career. I think what is new in regenerative agriculture is the level of interest has become unprecedented. And particularly when you look at the value chain companies, the Nestle's, the PepsiCo's, beginning to look at how they integrate regenerative agriculture practices by their own admissions without necessarily knowing what it is in their pathways to net zero. I think for farmers and land managers, there's been a great interest in jumping into regenerative agriculture because of the potential to earn economic incentives from it. Jürgen talked about that in the platform discussion. And we've seen it adopted increasingly as recently as yesterday. The Commission's new framework on certifying carbon removals from a nature-based perspective is based on regenerative agriculture practices. So what would it take to drive this? And I think you can see there from some of the headlines that we've seen in publications like the Financial Times, it certainly commands a level of interest. So over the last 6 months or so, we've asked these key questions. How do you define it? What are the benefits and costs? Barriers to adoption? What would be needed to accelerate adoption? And we did this in a series of workshops. We did some deep dive perspectives looking at those questions specifically from the perspective of growers, from agri-value chain actors, from policymakers. We supplemented it with bilateral interviews. We did some external research. We had the opportunity to spend some time in the Midwest of the United States asking the same questions during the summer. And there was plenty of other work that we were able to draw upon, including Prince Charles, or King Charles, I should say now, as a Sustainable Markets Initiative, which has been looking at this. Is there an emerging consensus? I'm not sure we could definitely say that. We could say certainly on some of the practices, I think there is some consensus about what could be included in a regenerative system, and you see them there on the slide, and I don't think that they are particularly new to anybody here. The crop rotations, the cover crops, the minimum or reduced tillage, the reduced use of the inputs, and the integration of livestock, as we heard from Alex on the platform. Perhaps the difference is, back to that thing that Tassos was talking about earlier this morning, is in outcomes. What are we trying to measure for here? For some people, regenerative agriculture is the way to secure the carbon capture and the storage, the emissions reductions. For others, it's about water quality. For others, at the core of it is improvements in soil health, or indeed in biodiversity. At the core of it, certainly for many of our participants in this exercise, it was unlikely to be achieved unless it was an outcome that delivers improved farm profitability. And then, of course, underneath that is how do you put a system around it that can accurately and honestly measure and account for the impact that these practices are having in a holistic way. And of course, as we've gone through the discussion, there's been this question about what is the right intervention to make. Is it one, as we talked about there with you, Thierry and Algis, is it a legislative, is it a stick-driven approach, or do we need the incentives, including the market-based incentives, in order to be able to drive this? And for us, coming out of it, one of probably the most powerful insights is probably the most obvious ones, and it's certainly something that I think was played back with Nestle and PepsiCo. When we talk about regenerative agriculture, we transition the field, not the crop. And so if we've got different crops in the rotation, as inevitably we do in Europe, Nestle need to figure out how they work with PepsiCo and other people in the value chain to ensure that the value that's created from the transition that might be achieved in one crop runs across the entire rotation. In terms of the grower's perspective on this, I think some of this will be obvious to many people in the room. The benefits: improved soil health, more resilient crops, potential increases in profitability, particularly if they can be paid for it, through the ability to monetize the value, whether that's through a carbon farming credit or by being paid by PepsiCo or Nestle for reducing emissions that they can count within their supply chain. The concern: continued liability for permanence, for example, in the case of carbon storage, and the big one, the cost of transition. If we are going to make this investment in transitioning and adopting regenerative agriculture practices in year 1, will we still be paid for that in year 10? Barriers: knowledge and advice, as we've talked about this morning. In some cases, access to the right machinery and innovation. We heard from one landowner in Belgium that there were 3 light direct seeder planters available in Belgium, each costing €250,000. Nowhere near enough in order to be able to provide that part of the infrastructure to support. We heard from a grower, where's Joe? We heard from a grower in the Midwest that was saying that in order to transition his farm in the United States Midwest, he had to go to 3 different banks in order to be able to secure finance that would secure his costs of transition, because they didn't understand the science that was behind it. To the other point, that the innovation system is supporting what society wanted 20 years ago, is not necessarily supporting what we need now. Another absence, another barrier to adoption. The skepticism about the durability of revenue. Again, that point about being paid in 1 year and not getting it for the next 10 years. And then in terms of acceleration, almost the converse, as you would expect, in terms of confidence in durable revenue streams, the knowledge transfer, the support from the CAP, but most importantly, what are we trying to measure, and what are the desired outcomes that we want? From the value chain's perspective, I mean, they're interested in regenerative agriculture. Resilient and sustainable supply chains was at the core of it. And then secondly, close second behind that, contribution that regenerative agriculture can make to their own emission reductions and their transition to those net zero plans. Less so, but still a factor, increased consumer engagement and brand affinity that the PepsiCos and the Nestle's of this world can drive through consumers. And of course, the big question mark in their minds is what's the cost of transition? It was a question that we didn't really pick up here in our discussion, but is the middle part of the chain prepared to pay for it? Well, the answer is yes and no. It's how do you create that value over time? Barriers, it's extraordinary. I won't pick on any individual company, but just how few in the value chain have got direct relationships with growers. Again, something that we've talked about a little bit this morning, at least implicitly, is that ability to build an understanding with landowners and farmers, so that we're working in unison rather than in silos. And of course, they've all got different metrics and desired outcomes that need to be aligned. Their big challenge, I think, is moving from pilots to scale. They've all got good pilot projects, but being able to scale that, I think, is seen as a challenge. And then the technology and the innovation, the acceleration, much the same as the grower perspective, but they really do need to try and find an alignment within the value chain in terms of what they're looking at. And then from the policymakers' perspective, well, it'd be interesting for Konstantin and others' perspective on this. I mean, the value, obviously, from some of this was the opportunity to improve the health of Europe's soils, to ensure the land use sector is able to make its contribution to climate neutrality, and indeed the creation of new durable revenue streams, whether they are public or market-based, was seen as an opportunity to do that. Again, challenges around costs of transition and investment in the research and the supporting infrastructure that would be needed to drive this. Barriers, we heard a little bit from Tassos, I think, in terms of what he was driving at, a tendency to focus on definitions and the legalese around definitions rather than on outcomes, and ensuring that there is coherence of policies between, say, farm to fork on the one hand, CAP on the other, and what DG Klima is trying to do in terms of its carbon removals approach. Those policies need to work together and be reinforcing rather than potentially working against each other. And public-private partnerships seen as absolutely key in this. So in terms of the takeaways that we've got from this work so far as we move into the final phase of this, it's clear that if we are going to scale regenerative agriculture in Europe and beyond, there does need to be this systematic alignment of innovation and technology and finance to support transition. Something back to Per's point this morning. The emerging revenue streams, particularly those that are market-based, can play a role, but there is real concern over durability of them and whether or not, as I say, the grower is still paid in year 10 rather than just in year 1. The quality of the science and the standards that will inform common metrics and the methodologies to ensure that we can have independent verification of outcomes, seen as key. And this point, which seems so obvious and yet so elusive, collaboration across the value chain with farmers and land managers, absolutely critical. And then the coherence of the EU and member state policy framework. So we're coming to the end of this process now. As I say, we've probably talked to over 100 stakeholders during the course of this work, all drawn from within the forum's ecosystem, if I can put it that way, and indeed beyond. We've looked at it from a European perspective. We've looked at it from the US perspective. We probably should have looked at it from the Brazilian perspective as well, Alex, so we still have time to follow up on that. We are completing the final pieces of research now, and we'll be putting the final report together to review with our workshop participants, and we look forward to sharing the final outcome of this in report format at the Forum's annual conference in the spring of next year. So we wanted to share that back with you. We thought that was quite hopefully you thought it was quite an interesting end to the discussions that we've had this morning. I don't know whether regenerative agriculture is the silver bullet, the panacea, but it feels that there is something around the alignment between those different stakeholder groups of land managers and growers with the value chain and indeed the policymakers to make that happen.